Healing the past, understanding and breaking the cycle of inherited trauma. I'm thrilled to have you join me for what is sure to be a powerful and enlightening conversation about how our past, especially the past of those who came before us, may be affecting our present lives more than we realize. Have you ever felt stuck in emotional patterns or encountered fears, anxieties that seem to come out of nowhere? Maybe you've noticed behaviors of trauma repeating themselves across generations in your family. If so, you're not alone. Today, we are discussing Today's discussion might give you understanding and insights you've been searching for. In this episode, we'll be diving into the concept of inherited family trauma as explored in the groundbreaking book It Didn't Start With You by Mark. This book sheds light on the fact that many of the struggles we face in life, whether emotional, psychological, or even physical, might not originate with us, but rather they might have been passed down from previous generations. Through the lens of neuroscience and epigenetics, Wolynn shows us how trauma, whether it's experienced through war, displacement, loss, or abuse, can be encoded in our genes, shaping not only our behavior but also very biology of our body. Trauma doesn't fade away when it's left unhealed. Instead, it lingers within families, often surfacing in future generations in unexpected ways. Today, we'll explore how this invisible inheritance manifests in our daily lives and how we can begin to heal from it, even if the origins are long buried in our family histories. So, whether you're dealing with anxiety, depression, relationship issue, or a sense of disconnection, stay tuned as we unravel the mysteries of inherited trauma and mostly how we break these cycles for good. Let's begin by breaking down the core concept of inherited trauma. What is it, how it works, and why it's so crucial for understanding our emotional and psychological experience today. At its most basic level, inherited trauma refers to the idea that traumatic experiences don't just affect the person who directly experienced them, they can be passed down from one generation to next. This means that even if you haven't personally gone through traumatic events such as war, displacement, abuse, or loss, the emotional and psychological residue of those experiences may still live within you, embedded in your DNA and influencing how we experience the world. The science behind this comes from an exciting and growing field called epigenetics. Epigenetics studies how our genes express themselves and how they can be influenced, not just by our environment, but the emotional and psychological experience of our ancestors. Trauma, in particular, can leave a biochemical mark on a person's gene, which is then passed down through generations. One of the most powerful examples of this is the research done on the descendants of Holocaust survivors. Studies found that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors showed higher level of stress hormones even though they themselves hadn't lived through the trauma of the Holocaust. These heightened levels of stress made them more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, and other stress-related conditions. The trauma experienced by the survivors had literally altered their gene expression and continue to affect subsequent generations. Now, this is just a theoretical concept. It's something that plays out in our daily lives in profound ways. Think about your family history. Perhaps your grandparents or great-grandparents lived through famine, war, or migration. Even if those stories are long buried, the emotional scars they left behind can still be influencing how you react to stress, from relationships or even navigate your daily challenges. Mark Wolynn in It Didn't Start With You shares several stories that illustrate this beautifully. One such example involves how a woman who struggled with chronic anxiety and a sense of impending doom that she couldn't explain. Through therapeutic exploration and understanding the concept of inherited trauma, she discovered that her grandmother had fled Europe during World War II, Leaving behind most of her family, this unresolved grief and fear had been passed down, manifesting in granddaughter's life as an unexplained anxiety. The most important thing you can understand here is the trauma doesn't live in our memories, it lives in our bodies. Neuroscience have shown that when we experience trauma, especially severe trauma, it activates the brain survival mechanism, shutting down parts of the brain responsible for speech and logical reasoning, while heightening the fight or flight response. This response doesn't just stop with the person experiencing the trauma. It can be encoded into the body and passed down. This is why you may feel sometimes a sense of dread or fear with no immediate cause, or why certain patterns of behavior like avoidance, hypervigilance, or distrust seem to run in families. It's not that you're born with it in a fixed way, rather, the trauma is passed down through generations and is expressed in your emotions through behaviors. Inherited trauma can show us a pattern of depression, relationship issue, financial struggle, and even physical illness. Sometimes that seem resistant to change because they have deep roots in unresolved family history. So what does it mean for us today? It means that our emotional, mental, and physical health is not just the result of our personal life experience, but the result of generations of lived experiences. Recognizing this opens the door to deeper healing, and it helps us understand that the pain or challenges we face might not start with us, but we have the power to end them. How trauma is stored in the body and mind. As we deepen our understanding of inherited trauma, we must recognize an essential truth. Trauma doesn't just live in our mind, it lives in our body. Often we carry the weight of trauma without even realizing it, both from our own experience and those passed down through generations. This is one of the most profound insights from Mark Wolynn. It didn't start with you, and it's crucial step into understanding how deeply trauma affects us, often beneath the surface. Let's start with what happens during a traumatic event. When someone experiences a traumatic situation, whether it's a sudden loss, abuse, or an overwhelming disaster, the body immediately shifts into survival mode. The brain activates the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing fear and initiating the flight or the fight mode. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logical thinking, and the Broca's area, which controls languages such as speech, shut down. This explains why during or after trauma, many people find themselves unable to put their experience in words. They literally froze, both mentally and emotionally. Now, the survival response is designed to protect us in the moment, to help us escape danger. But there's the problem. Trauma, when unresolved, stays with us. It fragments and embeds itself in the body, hiding in our nervous system or muscles or in our very cells. The brain and body carries these fragments, storing them in sensations, thoughts, and even emotional reactions long after the event has passed. And if the trauma isn't processed or healed, it can stay with us or even pass down to future generations. Scientific research has shown that trauma fragments remain embedded within the body. You may have heard the phrase, the body keeps the score, a concept that neuroscience now fully supports. Trauma gets lodged in our nervous system and presents itself in physical ways, such as chronic pain, headaches, digestive issues, or tension in the body. It shows up emotionally, creating patterns of anxiety, depression, irritability, or hyperprivilege, which seems to come from nowhere. Let me give you an example from the book. Wolynn shares the story of a man who suffered from severe back pain. After years of traditional treatment, physical therapy, medication, nothing seemed to work. He began to explore the emotional underpinning of his pain. Through therapy, it became clear that the back pain was directly linked to unresolved emotional trauma passed down from his father, who had endured a difficult life filled with loss and hardship. In his body, in a way, was inherited the burden of carrying the weight of his father's grief. The pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and it was lodged in his body. This hidden trauma often manifests as emotional and physical alignments. Even when the original source is unknown, have you ever experienced anxiety or depression that felt like it came out of nowhere? Like it wasn't tied to anything happening in your life at the time? Or maybe you've struggled with physical pain, chronic fatigue, or other mysterious symptoms that seem to have no clear origin. These are often signs that body is storing unprocessed or inherited trauma. When we carry trauma that hasn't resolved, it can resurface in ways we don't immediately recognize. For instance, inherited trauma can break us feel unsafe in relationships or trigger reactions that seem disappropriate to what's happening in the moment. You may find yourself overreacting to situations that find you of a past experience or an experience you've never consciously had, but one that's embedded in your DNA through generational trauma. You may avoid intimacy or feel inexplicable fear because your nervous system has been wired to respond to a danger that your ancestors faced. One example Warren gives is a woman who felt crippling anxiety every time her partner would leave on a business trip. She didn't understand why she had such an intense reaction to something as ordinary as a partner leaving for a few days. After exploring her family history, she uncovered that her grandfather had disappeared during the war, never to return, leaving her grandmother in constant fear and grief. This unresolved trauma of abandonment and loss had been passed down to her, manifesting as anxiety around separation in her present relationship. The brain is highly adaptive, and while this is beautiful quality in many ways, it also means that unresolved trauma creates neutral paths that continues to activate long after the danger has passed. It's like an alarm that never goes ringing or never stops ringing. And while these alarms were necessary for survival in the moment, they're harmful when they remain switched on for years, even lifetimes. So how do we begin to heal the trauma stored in the body and mind? First, it's important to understand that simply talking about the trauma isn't always enough. Since trauma is stored in the body, healing must also happen at a somatic level. Through practices that engage in body directly, such as breathwork, yoga, meditation, or somatic experiencing therapy, these methods help to experience the trauma fragments stored in body, allowing the nervous system to rest and bring the body back to a state of safety and calm. In the next segment, we'll explore how identifying inherited trauma patterns in the first step to healing and how tools like family, constellation, therapy, and other methods can bring these hidden traumas into light, allowing for deepened healing and transformation. Identifying inherited patterns. As we continue our journey into understanding inherited trauma, a crucial step in the healing process is learning how to identify the patterns we've inherited from our family line. The process of identification is key because many behaviors, fear, or emotional reactions we experience today are deeply rooted in unprocessed trauma of previous generations. Mark Wolynn in It Didn't Start With You introduces a powerful method of uncovering these patterns called core language. This is a technique where we identify recurring phrases of emotional themes that often reflect the unresolved fear and trauma of our ancestors. The language we use, especially the unconscious phrase we repeat or feel strongly about, can be a window into the hidden wounds of our family history. Let me give you an example of how core language can reveal inherited trauma. Wolynn shares the story of a man who had a deep-seated fear of financial ruin. Even though he had never experienced significant financial instability in his own life, no matter how much money he earned, he constantly felt anxious about losing everything. By working through his core language, especially the phrase, "I'm afraid I'll end up with nothing," he began to uncover the fear was tied to his grandfather, who had lost her entire family fortune during the Great Depression. That traumatic experience had been passed down through generations, manifesting in intense anxiety and found financial security, even though his parents' circumstances didn't justify such fears. Core language always revolve around themes like abandonment, betrayal, loss, or safety. Phases that seem out of proportion to our current reality. For instance, you might say things like, "I can't trust anyone. I'm always waiting for the other shop to drop." These statements often reflect hidden trauma carried by your family line. Identify this language in first step towards recognizing that some of your deepest fears of reactions may not be entirely your own. Another powerful method Wolynn discussed for uncovering inherited trauma is exploring family history. Often trauma manifests as behaviors of emotional responses that seem inexplicable because the origin story has been buried or lost. When we dig into family history, we may uncover stories that were unspoken for generations but are still affecting us today. In this book, Wolynn recounts the story of a woman who always spent a sense of impending doom. She struggled with depression and anxiety for most of her life and couldn't explain where these feelings came from. When she finally began exploring her family's past, she discovered that her great grandfather had been imprisoned in a concentration camp during World War II, and her grandmother had lived through years of fear waiting for him to return. The fear and grief of the time were never fully addressed, and those emotional wounds were passed down through the generation. Her sense of impending doom was in fact a reflection of her grandmother's unprocessed trauma. What's fascinating about family trauma, it isn't often hidden. Many families choose to speak of pain events or even bury these stories to protect the next generation. However, the stories don't go away. They become part of the emotional DNA, shaping our behaviors and perspectives. By bringing these hidden stories to surface, we can bring understanding why we might feel certain way, even if we've never experienced anything that seems to explain this. This is why exploring your family history can be such a powerful healing and enlightening process. Start by having conversations with the family members. Ask about a major loss, trauma, or significant event that shaped their lives. You might be surprised to discover these stories of hardship, abandonment, or struggle that you've never heard before. These stories often hold key understanding some of your own emotional and physiological challenges today. Even if you don't have access to detailed family history, there's still ways to uncover the patterns. Pay attention to recurring themes in your life. Do you have a pattern of failed relationship that mirrors the experience of your patterns of your grandparents? Are there repeating fears or anxieties that seem to come from nowhere? Are there phases you often say or think that reflect deep-rooted fears or beliefs? These are all clues to the unprocessed trauma that may be at work. By recognizing these patterns, we gain the ability to break them. Awareness is the first step in healing. When we identify the certain behavior or fear are not ours alone, we can begin the process of letting them go. It's not about blaming past generations, it's about understanding that we had inherited their emotional burdens and that we have the power to break these cycles and heal not just ourselves but our entire lineage. The healing process in breaking cycles. Now we've explored the trauma can be inherited and how to identify these deep-rooted patterns. We arrive at the most important part of the journey in healing. This is where Mark Wolynn work in It Didn't Start With You shines. He not only helps us uncover trauma but offers a roadmap to move from awareness to integration. Healing inherited trauma is a powerful process, one that starts with awareness to integration, but must involve acceptance and integration. Simply recognizing trauma or patterns is not enough. We must engage in practices that allow us to process and release these emotional patterns. Wolynn emphasizes that it's essential to move through these emotional rather than pushing them away or denying their existence. To truly heal, we must be willing to face what is uncomfortable and integrate those experiences into our life in a healthy and empowering way. Let's break the process down. The first step is understanding. When we become aware of the trauma we've inherited, we may feel anger, frustration, or sadness. It's natural to feel resentment for carrying the burden of someone else's pain, but it's crucial to accept that this is the part of our journey. By understanding the trauma isn't entirely ours, and that we have inherited it from generations before us, we can begin to separate our identity from the trauma. We no longer have to feel trapped. There's also this understanding that we need to get ourselves into, that God only gives suffering to those, or the universe, or the higher power, or just the passing on the pain would only be passed down to you if you are capable enough to channelize it and bringing back to love, joy, and safe and security. You won't actually face the issues if you don't have the power to heal them at the first place. Which is why you might see that it's not passed down to your other siblings, your cousins, or anybody else in the family but you. Because you have the power to transcend out of it, to ascend from it, and actually reach and turn the trauma, pain into love. This acceptance creates space for healings to begin. But how do we actually start healing these generational wounds? Wolynn suggests several practices that help us process and integrate trauma, many of which involves working with the body, mind, and simultaneously, one such method is somatic therapy, a practice that focus on releasing trauma stored in the body. Since trauma is not just held in the mind but also in the nervous system, somatic therapies like breath work, body scanning, and physical movement allow us to gently release the trapped energy that has been held within us, sometimes for generations. Another powerful tool is mindfulness and meditation. These practices help us bring into present moment, allowing us to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment. When we practice mindfulness, we create a safe space to acknowledge the pain, fear, and anger we may be carrying without letting it consume us. Meditation can help calm the nervous system, allowing the body and mind to reset and relax, creating fertile ground for healing. In these quiet moments, we can reflect on our inherited patterns and often ourselves, the compassion needed to release them. Wolynn also advocates the power of family constellation therapy, a therapeutic approach to work to identify the hidden dynamics within family and bring them to light. The practice helps individuals see the larger web of relationships and trauma within the family tree and gain a new perspective on how these unseen forces are influencing their lives. Family constellations work allows for healing on an energetic level, not just on the individual but the entire family line. An essential part of healing process is rebuilding relationship with family members, both living and dead. That doesn't necessarily means physical reconnecting with aggregated family members through that we can be the part of the journey, but rather energetically or emotionally acknowledging them. It may involve creating rituals, practices that honor your ancestors, such as lighting a candle for them, writing a letter for them, or simply holding them in your thoughts. These practices can bring a sense of closure and forgiveness and release. For example, Wolynn shares a story of a woman who had been disconnected from her mother for many years. Through the healing process, she began writing letters to her mother, expressing the feeling that she never could in person. This simple act of acknowledgement and expression allowed her to release years of emotional tension and led to a greater sense of peace, even though the mother had already passed. Now, you may be wondering, how can you begin the journey of healing inherited trauma? Here are a few steps you can take. Journal about your family history. Reflect on what you know about your parents, grandparents, and beyond. Write down a significant event, emotional pattern, or a phrase that have been passed down. Journaling allows you to see the connection between your present struggling and your family's past. Recognize the pattern. Once you have understood family's history, begin to notice where similar patterns show up in your life. Are there fears, behaviors, or emotional expressions that don't seem to align with your expression? Pay attention to recurring themes in relationship, finances, or health. These may be clues to inherited trauma. Seek therapy. Specialize in inherited trauma. Working with therapists who understand family systems, inherited trauma can incredibly healing. Therapies like family consultations, works, or somatic experience can help you safely explore and process these deep-rooted patterns. Practice mindfulness and self-compassion. Healing takes time, and it's important to treat yourself with kindness. Throughout the process, meditation, breathwork, and somatic practices can help ground you in the present moment, allowing you to gently release what no longer serves you. Remember, healing inherited trauma is not just about freeing yourself from the past. It's about breaking cycles of future generation. When we heal, we not only change our own lives, but create a ripple effect that affects to our children, their children, and beyond. The process may not be easy, but it's deeply, and the peace and freedom that follows are worthy at every step. As we wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment and reflect on what we've covered on the journey we've embarked on together. We begin by understanding the inherited trauma, those emotional and physiological wounds passed down from our ancestors. We can shape our lives in ways we may not even realize. Through the fields of neuroscience and epigenetics, we now know that the trauma can alter our genes and be passed through generations to the next. The trauma manifests in ways through recurring emotion patterns, fear behaviors, even physical alignments. It's often hidden, but it leaves traces in our lives, but waiting to be uncovered and healed. We explored how trauma is stored not only in our minds but also in our bodies. Unresolved trauma lives in the nervous system, often creating unexplained anxiety, chronic pain, emotional reactions that feel disappointed to our current reality. And while this trauma might not have started with us, it lives within us until we choose to face it. But awareness is the next step to healing. By identifying the core language of trauma and exploring our family histories, we begin to unravel threads of inherited pain and recognizing the patterns we have unconsciously adopted. The process is not easy, it's deeply liberating. When we bring these hidden traumas to light, we take back our power, we reclaim our freedom to live without the burden of the past. Healing is an ongoing journey. When, as Mark Wolynn teaches us, moving from awareness to acceptance and integration is key, whether through somatic therapy, mindfulness, or practices like family constellation work, we have tools available to help us release the pain stored in the body and mind. By embracing our family stories, whether through journal, meditation, or reconnected with estranged family members, we begin to heal not only ourselves but the generation that came before us. And perhaps the most important point to remember, healing inherited trauma is not just about you, it's about breaking the cycle of the generation. I invite you to take some time, reflect on your own family history. Are there stories of hardship, loss, trauma that never fully addressed? How might those experiences be shaping your life today? As you explore the questions, approach yourself with self compassion. Healing trauma is a dedicated process, and it's essential to be kind to yourself as you navigate it. There's no need to rush. Healing happens in its own time. And the fact that you're beginning this journey is a huge step in itself. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explore the deep rooted transformation work of healing of inherited trauma. I hope this episode offered you insights, clarity, and perhaps even the sense of relief that you were not alone in the journey. The pattern to healing is one we walk together, and each step brings us closer to freedom we deserve. I invite you to join me the next episode another week for another in-depth discussion on family dynamics and personal healing. We'll delve deeper into how consciously break toxic patterns and create meaningful, loving connections with ourselves, help us heal and get in the light of love. Until then, take care of your heart, your body, and your spirit. You're doing the work, and that is enough. Namaste, Radhe Radhe.